Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Dave Deptula, Dean of the Mitchell Institute for Aerospace Studies, and welcome to Aerospace Nation. Now, the Department of the Air Force is currently in a much-needed era of modernization. This spans everything from equipment, training, and concepts of operation. Given the severity of the security threat around the globe, these changes and improvements cannot come soon enough. The Department of the Air Force provides indispensable capabilities and capacity to our nation's security, so it's crucial that we empower airmen and guardians to fight and win. As part of these efforts, earlier this year, the Department of the Air Force unveiled some sweeping plans to re-optimize with special focus on how it's organized. While there are a lot of important actors involved in executing these efforts, few are as central as Dr. Tim Grayson, the Special Assistant to the Secretary of the Air Force. So we are incredibly pleased that he's with us here today to discuss where the Air Force is going and why. So Tim, welcome. Thanks very much for taking the time to be here. And to kick this thing off, let me turn it over to you for some opening perspectives.
Okay, well, thanks, Dave. And first of all, thanks to Mitchell and thanks to the audience for joining in. It's great to have opportunities to get the message out here. So I've been describing to people that essentially there are three lines of effort that I have going on that relate to this right now. And as you certainly know, and I think most of the audience hopefully is very well aware, my initial role in all of this has been through the operational imperatives. So Secretary Kendall brought me in back at the beginning of 2022 and to help organize these operational imperative activities. So job number one is that, not without a certain amount of delays that I think we'll talk about a little bit more, but we do finally have our FY24 appropriation in place and money going to programs. And so a big part of it has been making sure that, because we were wildly successful in that 24 budget for modernization, that the money's actually going where the original plans were aligned. So that's job one. The work on operational imperatives continues. So we've been continue doing the operational imperative studies, and things are looking actually pretty good right now from an OI perspective for 26. Which we just completed. You did the introduction talking about optimization for great power competition. So the third big line of effort has been our role from an OI vantage in GPC. And before the secretary started even talking about optimization for great power competition, we were already thinking, we think, without being too parochial, that we've been pretty successful with these operational imperatives. It was all a pickup game. It was all pretty ad hoc. How do we make sure we can maintain and sustain that way of doing business, irrespective of individuals and personalities and that kind of thing? So we've been doing a lot of work within GPC to make sure we can keep the modernization activities going the way we have under the operational imperatives.
Well, very good. I appreciate that kind of overview. Let's just jump right into some of these issues, and I'd like to start with the budget.
Yep.
This one's a real challenge because, as you've talked about and everyone's aware, the Air Force is striving to do its best to meet the tenets of the National Defense Strategy to deal with these challenges that we talked about. And it's tough because the mission that's placed on the Air Force, as we were talking about before we started, are much greater than the resources that we have to accomplish it. And in the Space Force's particular case, it's even tighter because their budget was cut by 2% this last time around. At the same time, our adversaries don't face these kinds of challenges. So could you help us better understand the challenges that this is driving for both the Air Force and the Space Force?
Yeah, certainly. I can't go into a lot of gory details, but I can give you a flavor for what this is about and what it's causing. So the whole reason we needed operational imperatives in the first place gets to some extent back to what you're describing. So, we have been doing a good job for a long time of building budgets that the main objective, quite frankly, is make a budget that closes. And then anything else strategically beyond that is great to have. And that's not derogatory toward anyone, it's a fact of life. And as you look at that being fixed, And in some cases, depending upon how you do Washington math or not, and throw in inflation and such, actually could be on a downslope in terms of actual real buying power.
Right.
That, there's no slop in there. It's not like there's extra money lying around to go do other things. So already that core budget for foundational accounts and for readiness is already under a lot of strain. Okay. Now you say, and we need to prepare the force for what we got to go do in the future and meet a very aggressively, rapidly evolving threat that, like, as you point out, doesn't necessarily have these constraints. So where do you go find trade space when you're already less than what you need for the mission you're being asked to go do? That's been the dilemma. So on the positive side of all of that, again, I think we've been wildly successful in getting resources aligned for modernization. And that has come with things like having a well-defined strategy, having analytic backing for it, being able to say, here's what the threat is doing. It's threat informed. Here is the solution and the strategy of how to go about attacking that and addressing it. That has gotten us a lot of support, certainly within the department of figuring out how we put resources against that. It hasn't moved the needle to where we fully need to be, but it's also helped us externally in getting some additional top line. So for example, in FY24, we were able to go in and say, okay, we're going to do our darndest to find some of that trade space, even though it comes with pain, to get modernization going. And the fact that we had this very systematic approach to doing that actually won us a lot of favor from OSD and from Joint Force Support. So it actually did in FY24 raise the TOAs of both services, which has been good. 25 was tough for everyone. You well know of what the implications of the Fiscal Responsibility Act were. That took a lot of the gains of 24 and at best flatlined them. In a lot of cases, again, it effectively was negative in terms of buying power. So that's essentially come out of hide. So now we are left with a really tough decision of either take risk with readiness, take risk with force structure, reverse gains that are being made on modernization, or we get relief on the missions we have to go through. But you got to move a lever somewhere, and that's really what the challenge has been. That, if anything else, I would argue that was probably the first big motivator for the secretary to start talking about optimization for great power competition. We don't really today have the mechanisms to make those really hard budgetary trades against a very constrained top line reality.
Right. Well, thanks for that. You mentioned the 24 budget. The secretary stated that in that particular budget, it reflected a shift to new capabilities over sustaining the service's legacy platforms. Could you talk to the secretary's intent with respect to that regard?
Yeah, so the reality is, and we can't go into the full details in this forum, but if you look at the rapid evolution of the threat, at some point in time, we're not there yet, but the threat's evolving very, very rapidly. You hit a point in time where you say, hey, we got a lot of great capabilities, but they aren't going to be the capabilities we need against that future threat. And we can't just flip a switch and expect a whole bunch of new things to materialize. So it's a really daunting problem that relates back to your budget question. You almost need to be paying for two air forces at once, because we have to pay the acquisition costs to build the future force before the future force is fielded. And so this really gets into we got to make sure we maintain readiness, but at some point in time, we're going to have to say, okay, let's start exchanging the force we have for the force we need to meet the evolving threat.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. The challenge and the frustration is we all understand it. Our audience understands it. But a strong defense isn't even in the top 10 talking points of either of the presidential candidates. So before we leave this topic on money, let me, if the budget caps weren't, bad enough, the Department of the Air Force has had to deal with continuing resolutions. for years on end. And those, as you know, drive enormous costs. So I wanted to ask you about your perspective on these congressionally driven impediments to progress, and just how's that affecting the Air Force and the Space Force?
The continuing resolutions have been a big impact. Now, I will say the one thing that has helped a little bit, but it's barely even scratched the surface, is, and again, this is largely coming from our committees. I have to say, the four committees that we care most about have been fantastic. I mean, and by and large, especially from a modernization perspective, have been very supportive. And they did provide the secretary, and this is not just for the Department of the Air Force, but he largely was the motivation behind it, a quick start authority, which helps a little bit. This allows you to say, okay, if I have a new program capability that's waiting for an authorization bill and an appropriations bill that, who knows when it's going to come under a CR, gives him more flexibility for doing reprogramming, getting things started. But in general, the CRs are saying, hey, you can't even start these new capabilities. So if we're trying to do modernization, we're waiting and waiting and waiting. Even for things that technically exist as current programs that aren't waiting for new start authorities, a lot of the modernization activities generated big ramps and step functions in the amount of resources and the focus of those resources. So they, for all practical purposes, were new starts, even if they weren't new starts in a statutory sense. So the result of that, if you think about the timing, I forget the exact date now where we got the appropriation, but it's only been a couple of months ago, and then it takes time for money to start working its way through the department and hitting program offices. We are just now getting money into program offices that are the first dollars that came out of any of these studies that started going 3 years ago.
Right.
And then if you layer that against the political cycle, and you say, hey, there's always the possibility of significant personnel and leadership turnover, we're just getting started on executing the strategy.
Yeah.
When potentially we're looking at a whole new team. So that becomes the other complication. If we're going to be delaying things, and it's CRs, it's also frankly PPBE, acronym soup, planning, programming, budgeting, and execution.
Yeah, the process.
Our money process.
Right. Well, let's shift gears a bit. One of the OIs is getting a lot of attention nowadays, and a big initiative on the part of the Air Force is Collaborative Combat Aircraft, or CCAs. Sure. Here at Mitchell, as you know, we're big fans of CCAs. We just completed a 3-day war game on the function, on the concept of operations. Could you give our listeners a bit of an update on just where we are, or where the department is on CCA?
Yeah, so I can't speak too much for the program office because they're very robustly charging forward on them. But there are a couple big themes that are resonating. First of all, at the end of the day, and this is very consistent with a lot of the Mitchell studies that I know I've been following, I know are going on, it's about trying to get to more mass, and it's trying to generate mass in a way where we can accept risk. And so we can be more aggressive on offensive type of operations. If we're not going to cry dearly if we lose a platform here and there, then most importantly, we're not losing airmen in the process of that. So that was the original motivator for CCAs, and a long list of additional missions we can address more effectively with attritable, affordable mass. Interesting additional things are bubbling out of that. As the program office gets going, and there was a big press release back in April that they have very quickly, look at the timelines. I mean, the other interesting thing, this is a combination of the nature of CCAs combined with just frankly an incredible program office that's very insightful and innovative in how they're doing things. The fact it went from concept and things still hanging out in the lab to the first development contract in a little over a year. That's kind of the stuff of the 60s that we hear about.
Right.
And so that by itself has been a huge success story, is getting going on actually building the prototypes and very fast time to field. That's been a big theme. But the additional offshoots from that, for instance, we've stood up something called an experimental operations unit. And this is of the recognition that, how you operate a squadron of CCAs, or Do we even call it a squadron? Who knows?
Do we put them in a
Do
school?
we put them in a squadron? The whole concept of employment, concept of operation of these very low cost, attritable, risk acceptant platforms is probably better not be exactly identical to how we would do a squadron of current TAC air. In addition, one of the nice offshoots, and this was another benefit of the great way the program office did the design work, we got some performers that really leaned into it and have gotten to the point where we can have not just attritable platforms, but also easier to operate and maintain. Well, you go back to experimental ops unit, maybe I ought to change the footprint of how I do maintenance around these things. Maybe I can have different logistical models. And that's opening the aperture that we're now exploring entirely new basing and fielding concepts, bed down concepts, the full operational life cycle concepts. All of that is very rapidly emerging from the CCA ideas. So it's just very exciting to see how it goes from a cool, very important idea about an airplane to really generating whole new thoughts on how we're going to go fight.
The whole ecosystem. Yeah, got it. Appreciate that. And let's just build a little bit on your previous comments. We know the Air Force is working very closely with some of our key industry partners on CCAs, and as you have spoken about, it's been quite successful so far. And the way I understand it, some of these early stages of success stem from product teams that are working to develop key attributes rather than hard requirements. Could you expand on that idea a little bit more?
Absolutely. That's been really, really powerful. And CCAs are a great example of this, but we're starting to apply this model more in other places as well. The whole notion is, there have probably been most of the audience is aware almost at the level of mantra now, and probably other speakers have bemoaned the requirements process and how burdensome the requirements process is. Well, requirements are a good thing at one level because it's making sure that the warfighter gets what they need. The problem is how we apply requirements. And the legacy model, I'll borrow something, I'm a tech geek, so I'll borrow something from the software world. It's a waterfall process. We get warfighters together, we do a bunch of studies against the warfighting concepts and develop a picture of what we think this needs to be operationally before we ever look at what can we actually build. And so we get a big, laborious, detailed requirements document that then gets thrown to a program office and ultimately thrown to a contractor. And then they say, what's it going to take to go build this? And that's where we run into trouble with cost growth and with technical risk. And that possibly leads to program runs and execution. And at the end of the day, once the operator sees what you actually get from it, they're like, I'm not sure I really wanted that. This notion of a product team allows you to compress that whole process. It doesn't get rid of it. It doesn't bypass it, but it compresses it. And I hate to say it, so human beings can work with human beings and interact rather than doing this very procedural, game of, frankly, telephone tag, where, you can have the operators are still critical. They are key to it, but they are coming into the dialogue, not hard and fast requirements, but what we're calling attributes. These look like requirements, but they're not statutorily, thou shalt hit exactly this number against this figure of merit.
Right.
Instead, it's here are the kinds of things I care about. Here are some targets for numbers against these characteristics. Now, use that to get industry on contract and start doing detailed design studies. It's almost like an in situ AOA you could think of, even though we had other stuff that checked the block for AOA activities. It's that kind of iteration that allows industry to say, this attribute, this is really hard. Do you really mean this? And the operator can come back and say, yeah, that's actually very important. But even for those, they can explain the nuance of why they care. And industry might have a different idea of how to satisfy that. There may be other cases the operator says, it seemed like the right thing. I don't care that much. And in a couple of rare cases, you could have industry coming back and saying, hey, operator, you're being too conservative. What would you do if I could give you this? So it allows that dialogue that then lets you converge on something where we can still codify that in a formal requirement. And then the idea is wash, rinse, repeat. That allows continued response as you see the classic issues that come up during programs, as you get new fielding ideas like we were just talking about. Even thinking about how am I going to accelerate into future iterations and increments and spirals.
That's a great explanation. As I'm listening to you, I'm wondering, so well, why didn't we start doing this 20 years ago? You don't have to answer. Another particular topic that is on the department's minds, that's kill chains, because they represent another major Department of the Air Force effort, specifically beyond line of sight kill chains. Yeah. We need this capability, obviously, to be able to operate effectively in the Indo-Pacific region. Could you talk a little bit about some of the elements that go into making beyond line of sight kill chains function?
Yeah, absolutely. And first of all, you hit the nail on the head. This is a very critical aspect of how we foresee evolving our way to fight. Can't go into the full gory details, but essentially the same kind of things you think about in any kill chain applied to a beyond line of sight kill chain. I need a sensor. I need a way to make sense of the data and generate targets. I need a weapon and a platform to deliver the weapon, and I need a way to connect all of it together. Today, and what our terminology is an organic kill chain, is all of that's effectively happening within a jet. The sensor, the weapon it's carrying, the communication is happening on the bus of the jet. All we're really doing in beyond line of sight kill chains is breaking that apart into piece parts. Now, easier said than done. What has been happening is and this isn't really all of national security. Best example of true jointness coming together, where we've got some organizations and agencies that are building sensors, including some Title 50 things that are in close cooperation, but also getting into new realms. Title 10 building its own sensors as part of these kill chains. We've got a tremendous push for beyond line of sight communications. This is not our SATCOM of today, and certainly not the SATCOM of yesterday, where you're carrying a terminal that only talks to one satellite. This is almost more like the internet, where everything can just kind of talk to space, and you're not worried about which satellite and which protocol you're on. That's a critically important part for how we connect sensor to shooter and move this data around at high velocity. There's a very complex problem of how you manage all of that. It's the sense making. I'll oversimplify it. As a technologist, it hurts me to do this, but I'll call it fusion. It's all the analytics that have to go into that. That can't be viewed as an intelligence process. With another buzzword, PED. Right. With human beings and analysts, that's got to be automated. We got to think more like a tracker in a seeker, or a tracker in a aircraft. That's what has to be going on in the sense making, not a classic intelligence function. And in fact, that's an interesting way I think about it sometimes. Imagine this kill chain loop is the fire control loop inside a seeker and a missile guidance system. Except now we've blown it out over a few thousand miles.
Enterprise.
That's right. So it's all those kinds of things that we have to build. So we've got programs that are doing those piece parts. And then, the other big theme that I personally, this from our past discussions, has been a big theme of mine is how do we do the complexity of what is a massive system of systems problem? And I think there's been some really exciting advances of how we manage all of these different piece parts in a coordinated, synchronized manner without crushing it under the bureaucracy of a massive JPO or something like that to manage it all as one program. So it's really some great stuff that's happening.
No, that's great to hear. Now let's build on what you just said and talk a bit about spectrum dominance, because that's required for us to kill these, close the long-range kill chains. But during a conflict, we're going to come under a lot of pressure because we're going to be facing a contested spectrum environment. So could you speak a bit on the joint long-range kill chain organization and just what it's doing to attempt to increase the resiliency of the kind of kill chain process you just talked about?
So let me unpack two different parts of your question there, Dave. On the resiliency piece, our big push there is, and again, this is one of these areas I can't go into a ton of detail on, but you know, there's two classic schools of thought for resiliency. One is armor and harden the heck out of things, and the other is go with diversity and proliferation. And it's really the latter, because what ends up happening is you can spend so much time and money and effort on hardening things that you start degrading your own capabilities. So without being able to go into the specifics, I think we've made huge strides of hitting resiliency through diversity and mass and quantity. So that's really where the big push is there. You asked about JLO, and it's not explicitly about resiliency, although that's part of the job jar. It really gets back more to my comment about the system of systems problem and the jointness of the system of systems problem. And the amazing part of the story with JLO gets down to it's about people. Okay. Every single time as a government, we go in and we try to say, hey, we're going to pull all this together with a big formal joint program office organization. It usually ends up dying under its own weight. And I'm not going to disparage any prior activities, but I think most of the audience probably can think of a few programs in their own personal experience.
I have no problem saying JPO for F-35 ought to go. I mean,
what happened with JLO is under the operational imperative structure, we already had people focused on solving these particular problems. And again, it's the same product team model. People who understand the operational need, people who understand all these myriad complex technical parts, and very quickly realized a lot of the people that need this and have things to bring to the table are not Department of the Air Force. So it all started because of a very enterprising 06 in the Air Force and a very enterprising GS-15 in the Navy came together and said, let's work together. Shocking. Okay. Yeah. And then they bring their organizations. And the interesting thing is JLO has no formal authority. It's not a real organization, so to speak. All of the authorities, and for that matter, accountability, come from the people who participate in it, have home organizations that bring that authority and accountability. But the people coming together can coordinate and solve problems and do real work and get things done that then can be executed in a federated manner. And JLO provides that forum for them to hash those things out. It has taken on some degree of formality, but I would say in a good way. It's gotten enough recognition that it's getting some top cover without being absorbed into a large formal structure. We're trying to keep it that way.
Yeah.
The other side of all of it, there has been some discussion, but again, it has to happen organically, grassroots, for it to be effective. But we're looking at, back to your resilience and spectrum dominance question, the other side of the equation. How do we make sure that other people don't have effective kill chains? And so we're contemplating creating something called a JCLO, a joint counter long-range kill chain organization. So the idea is to not say it's been successful here, so let's just keep glomming on responsibilities that causes it to grow uncontrolled. It's really trying to say, okay, how do we replicate the model of human beings coming together to get stuff done?
Yeah, I know that's great. I mean, gotta boil it down. People matter and size
Absolutely.
matters.
That's right.
Good people, small size equals success. Okay, let's switch gears a little bit more, but it's related to what you already said. And I'd like you to share with our audience some of your perspectives on M-series concept as the Air Force builds its next generation of precision-guided munitions and what that means for addressing the service's current PGM deficit.
So this even loops back, the original motivation loops back to your budget question. Okay, we don't have enough top-line money for munitions, full stop. That being said, we've got two greatly conflicting, competing priorities. Again, at the pace of evolution of warfare and the pace at which threats evolve and the pace at which our own warfighting concepts evolve, we don't necessarily have the weapons that we want right now. So we need capabilities that expand the types of weapons we have and the diversity of that weapon portfolio. At the same time, we don't have enough weapons, period, of any kind. We don't have capacity that we want. So, the notion of saying, if I'm going to give you a fixed amount of money and I want you to design more things and build more things, those are diametrically opposed. So when you take that set of over-constrained problems and then mix it with the CCA theme of how do we get to affordable mass, a couple magical things have happened. The first was a focus on a low-cost cruise missile concept that we're now calling the affordable mass munition. The whole notion is something that is good enough that it can still have effect, but we can afford to produce it in mass quantity, and it can solve problems in these long-range kill chains. So that started kind of as its own concept. In parallel, and it's kind of weird how these things happen, something that was kind of boring infrastructure. People within our weapons SPO, LCMC, EB, were thinking about how we do a better job of applying digital engineering. And said, if we built a software programmable, modular, but recoverable air vehicle that looks a lot like a missile and flies over most of a missile envelope, that could greatly accelerate how we do test. And it was sort of like chocolate and peanut butter coming together. This modular thing for testing purposes that's very adaptable, if one of the modules is a warhead, sure looks like a low-cost cruise missile. Okay. And so that got going down the direction of saying, let's go build out a variant for this low-cost weapon that we can build in mass. But then it gets better. Because it's software programmable, the notion was, why couldn't I do additional variants of that? And it isn't necessarily just low cost. We could start doing high-end, more exquisite variants, but based upon the same reference architecture. So that is beget the M series concept. So it's hard to say you draw a line when you've got one data point. So it's still a concept. Sure. It's not proven. But the theory behind it is that we can again have our cake and eat it of both diversity and quantity by going in and saying we're going to get an M series discount. How much cheaper can I buy a new weapon variant if it's part of this common family versus it's a blank sheet design? So, we're looking for opportunities to save money on reuse of subsystems, on reuse of design models, on accelerating a lot of design and test. We're even starting to explore very innovative ideas for how do we create more elasticity in manufacturing. How do you get away from saying one of our big costs that limits us? Every time I build a new weapon variant, frankly, the same thing goes for aircraft as well and other systems. I got to build a factory. Well, gee, that's expensive. That makes every new variant very expensive. It takes more time. And we're limited, again, in that capacity. Well, if I can have a much more elastic base, that allows me to start those things faster. And like we're seeing in Ukraine, or the desire that we'd like to have to support Ukraine, wouldn't it be great to be able to throttle that production capacity? Those are the kinds of things we're striving for with M series.
That's great. No, thanks for those insights. Now, not every effort to re-optimize for great power competition is high tech. And one of the concepts that's out there has become very important is agile combat employment.
Sure.
But for that to work, it requires this entire architecture, if you will. It's not just about having the bases, but the resiliency, the ability to defend those bases, the ability to resupply. And then I hate to say it because I know it's going to be part of your answer too, but it's the budget thing. But so what is the Air Force's real feasibility in order to be able to actualize this concept?
So I think I'm actually pretty optimistic on this. I think we're already making great strides. So we started looking at this. Of course, the MAGCOMs were already looking at the general concept. Even in, as we call it, season one of the operational imperatives, our OI5 was all about how do we bring the resources and start actually, no kidding, provisioning these ACE concepts. So I can't go into exact numbers, but we do have several ACE clusters for the Indo-Pacific that we're getting provisioned, and very significant resources in that 24 budget that are starting to roll. I think the other good news story about ACE is, things we were alluding to earlier about the very rapid pace of change and, the tensions between readiness versus modernization and all that. The ACE construct is one of the most important ones for being able to support that evolution as it evolves. So we can put, provisioning against current ACE clusters that support a fight tonight capability. They give us resilience in operating with our current systems, with our current basing concepts and all. The flip side is we were talking a moment ago about CCAs and how CCAs open up, new opportunities and new concepts of employment. Well, some of that might be, what does basing look like? And what do airfield operations look like, and all of those kind of what's the logistics tail look like for CCAs versus versus a large wing of crewed fighters, and the fact we've got ACE allows us a nice clean transition to thinking about what would base and fielding concepts be for some of these evolving, advancing capabilities. So I think there's a nice continuum there that helps support us move from the fight tonight, very strong readiness, into fielding of modernized capabilities.
And what I take away from your answer is the resources are being adequately supplied.
We'd always like to have more. Okay. Yeah. Now the question, because
but are you going to get enough?
It's about capacity. So we are certainly getting enough to have a baseline capability.
Okay.
And quite frankly, while given our current sort of force design and lay down and all of that, absolutely we'd like more. But before we get too upset about that, we also have to look at how all that's going to evolve.
Sure.
So there may be things where we say, hey, we need this much amount of additional resources based upon how we're fighting today. But by the time we get there, we might have a different way of fighting. So we're not in a bad spot.
Well, that takes us into my next question, which is focused on Air Force future force design, and not just Air Force, but Space Force as well.
Yeah.
Both the Futures Organization as well as the Space Warfighting Analysis Center are advancing their different concepts with respect to service force designs. Can the Department of the Air Force ensure that these efforts keep pace with the emerging threats?
So, a short answer, I'll say off the cuff, is yes, of course. So I don't want to speak for the force design efforts. I am at one level a partner and maybe a little bit of both a customer and a service provider to them. I mean, those are organizations that are being, led by our most innovative senior, warfighters. They're the ops piece when we think of the ops and capability of the OI model. What I see happening under all that, and to the notion of pace, is there's a new thinking emerging that is, in my terminology, this is not a formal doctrinal term. How do we go slow to go fast? So, when we think about force design, the knee-jerk reaction, and this is across DoD, I think maybe even the first time we met, I was probably running around in a different community doing a quick reaction program or something like that. And I would say historically, we've got one of two extremes. It's either that quick reaction mindset, which says, I'm going to go MacGyver something and get it out there and duct tape and baling wire, or I'm going to do a big, laborious, slow, very thoughtful thing. We're looking at ideas in the middle that say, look, we want to do some things to go fast that both give the warfighter a fight tonight capability, but from that force design evolutionary perspective, become almost, I don't want to make an operational capability sound like a sandbox, but it also allows a certain amount of learning and experimentation in a real world environment. Walking in here, we were talking about your trip to Israel. Talk about a real world learning environment. Yes, they're fighting a war. Everyone should be learning from what's going on there. We field capabilities quickly. We're going to learn. And that's going to feed force design. Also, if we get things, M series is a great example. CCAs are a great example. The wonderful work going on in the C3 battle management area, super example, where it's not just that one-off that you have to throw away after you use it for tonight. It's creating an architecture. It's creating a framework that allows us to then do continuous evolution. So we got the warfighters learning from how things are working, fielding the MacGyvered stuff. And at the same time, we've got the technologists that are saying, okay, what of that do we need to maintain? But regardless, how do we get the architecture in place that allows us to sustain this and evolve it more rapidly? So I think we've got that technology and ops coming together in a really nice way right now.
Man, I really applaud that kind of an approach. And you laid it out very, very clearly. And for those folks who are involved in future force design out there, I hope you've inculcated that perspective.
It's been really interesting. In fact, this was a discussion that I was just having with the secretary last week, as he and I came up with the same insight. It's been pretty exciting to see where we have gotten so far, in that some of the things we were talking about 3 years ago, we probably would have been either laughed or yelled out of the room being crazy. And what I'm starting to see, we're not there yet. There's a ton of hard work to still be done.
You bet.
But I'm seeing that in terms of cultural aspects and idea aspects, the department, now we walk into rooms and there's great strategic dialogue going on. And if something weird and crazy is brought up in a conversation, it's usually in the context of, it's obvious we have to go do this. Now let's do the hard nug work and figure out how. So even if we aren't where we'd love to be, I'm very, very optimistic on where the flywheel's taking us.
No, that's great to hear. Which, let me give you an opportunity to ponder a bit. I mean, I can't. It's difficult to believe that how many years have gone by since the OIs were implemented. Obviously, just as you've described, they've sort of set the pace for where the department is going. Could you share with us some of your lessons learned in the context of just what you experienced to get those OIs going?
Yeah, absolutely. And in fact, this will probably lead us into some discussion of the GPC work that's going on as well. We actually, before the secretary started talking about optimization for great power competition, we were looking at exactly this problem, because we're not ignorant to political cycles and term appointments and things of that nature, and said, okay, we think, without being too parochial, that the operational imperatives have done some pretty good stuff. How do we sustain that and not make that personality dependent? And so we actually built a whole lessons learned study and lessons learned document. What is interesting about it is, at the end of the day, there are a couple macro level lessons learned. I've already alluded to probably the most important one, and it comes out in the product teams as well. Bring the operator and the capability developer together. Don't do the waterfall requirements. I would say that there are, from the capability and the technology side, we inherited I would say an unfortunate culture that a lot of developers have been so beaten to. You will listen to the operator and follow requirements, that people were gun shy about getting out of that lane. On the operator side, I kind of saw one of two I'll say failure modes. The majority were an analog to the capabilities people. Someone hasn't shown me a new technology. I don't have a fielded program of record. Why should I think about operational concepts for something that doesn't exist? And then there were a handful of operators, and you know who you are out there, who are very, very creative and innovative, but don't necessarily have the grounding in the science and in the acquisition, capabilities. And it's the classic cartoon OV1 of, I just like to say, the flying puppy dogs and teleporters. And wow, there's a great ops guy. The reality is, by bringing those two sides together, we've been able to leave neither of them self-limited. And so you can have equal innovation going on where it might be a great idea where it's an operational innovation, but we don't quite have the kit to be able to do that. The technologist can say, yeah, of course I can build this for you. Or they might say, no, that's a flying puppy dog. But you could do this now that I understand what you're thinking about from an operational concept. So that's been magical, bringing ops and capabilities together. Another big piece that relates to that, there has been I will say, a culture of self-censoring, self-limiting, because we assume, oh, there isn't a requirement already, or I haven't done all the homework and have a full programmatic structure and full technical risk reduction, or the budgetary thing we were talking about earlier. This feels expensive and I'm worried I might not be able to afford it or have to take it out of hide. We've got 101 reasons why we don't let really great innovative ideas see the light of day. What this whole process has done is it hasn't guaranteed that any of it's going to make it, but it's provided a forum where those good ideas can actually emerge and get visibility and consideration at the highest levels of the department. And that gets to the third big lessons learned is you got to have a certain amount of rigor, analytics, and discipline so it doesn't just become the good idea fairy and an open hunting season to bring things back into resourcing. So those have all been really important coming together. So we documented that. I would say overarching all of that is as we look through sequentially what were the steps we did and what were the activities we did, you could argue that just at a checklist level, the department was already doing all those things. Back to people matter. It was about behaviors. It was about how people did functions, not what functions they did. So a lot of what we've also been looking at is how do you capture the behavioral aspects of it and really that softer skill, cultural aspect of it as we figure out where the functions are going to continue.
Well, I got to tell you, I'm happy to hear what you just said, because from my perspective, at least the first decade of the 21st century, there was way too much authority placed in the acquisition world to the absence of operator input. But that's something we could continue to talk about. But I do want to leave some time for our audience.
Sure.
I'm going to give you one quick, as quickly as you can, and the question's about standing up the Integrated Capabilities Office, which was announced that you're the first guy to sit on top of that this past week. Secretary Kendall, when he announced this, as well as the Integrated Capabilities Command, said there's going to be a built-in tension. Could you talk a little bit about the value of that tension and why he took that perspective?
So first of all, I want to put out a big qualification. I am not sitting atop the ICO. I was tasked to create the ICO, and we are working on hiring the first ICO director, which will not be me.
Okay, well, for the time being.
So just for the audience that isn't following GPC speak within the Air Force, the context there, Integrated Capabilities Office, in a nutshell, is an organization to continue perpetuating the kinds of things we've been doing with operational imperatives. That all the OIs were done totally ad hoc. It was a pickup game. ICO is going to continue that in a slightly more formal structure. I don't want to by any means contradict or take issue with my boss. I don't actually see tons of tension. The way that we executed operational imperatives, the reality is all of the work in the OIs was done by people from organizations that would be represented now by ICC. There There's one person in the entire department who has OIs as a full-time job, and he's talking right now. Everyone else was doing OIs as part of their assignments in some other organization. And that operator view and all of the OI teams tended to come from the Air Force perspective, either A57 or MAGCOM. And similarly from Space Force, it would come from SWAC or maybe some operational space unit. Well, that parallels ICC and space futures. So at the end of the day, I'll say the first thing is the work of the ICO is going to depend and work with and leverage an ICC and a space futures for that voice of the operator. The second big thing is the way we are structuring ICO. At the end of the day, it's going to have both incredible power and no power at all. There are no formal authorities. It can't move people's cheese, can't move budget, can't generate requirements, can't do any of that. The power that ICO will have will come from its position and insights and influence. So back to my comment of lessons learned of the self-censoring, ICO is effectively that voice of modernization. It's the stakeholder that makes sure that new ideas get a day in court. So in that regard, will sometimes those new ideas be at odds with something coming out of an ICC or something like that? If anywhere, that's where the potential tension happens. But again, the goal is to the generation of those ideas being as collegial and collaborative as painfully possible. And only at the very end does it reserve the right to still say, hey, we think this is a really important idea. We don't know how it's all going to fit, but it's got to be considered by senior leadership. I think that's the only place where we see that kind of tension, maybe.
Well, great. Let's switch to our audience. You all know the drill here. So when I call on you, just tell us who you are and ask your question. But don't forget to turn on your mic. So let's start with Teresa Hitchens.
Hi, this is Teresa. Can you hear me?
Go ahead. We got you. Yeah, we got you.
Okay, hi. Thanks for doing this. Nice to hear from you, Dr. Grayson. My question is on this new idea or consideration of a new office, the JCLO, you called it. Could you just expand just a little bit on what that office would be doing that would be different from what the JLO is doing?
So first of all, I want to be clear that the JLO isn't really an office. It's the whole nature of its impact has been the fact that it has been so grassroots and informal. So no one ordered the creation of a JLO. It happened because really great human beings decided to work together. The whole point in mentioning a JCLO is frankly exactly that. As we look at really important missions, another one of these massive system of systems problems is how we bring together things like, EW capabilities, cyber capabilities, other things that would, could be employed to break a bad guy's attempts to create these kill chains. Any of these massive system of systems problems need this kind of collegial collaborative type of organizational structure. And again, to make it work, coming in with a policy statement that's saying thou shalt just violates the whole principle of making it grassroots and organic. I'm just tossing it out there that's saying in consideration, this is sort of the next type of big system of systems problem that would merit from one of these sort of self-forming organizations. But we don't have an intent to go stand up a formal office structure for counter kill chain.
Thank you. I appreciate the clarification.
Absolutely.
Okay, John Harper, you've got your hand up. Go ahead.
Great. Thank you for doing this. Just to follow up on what you were saying about the JCLO, do you have any kind of idea of when that might potentially be organized? How many personnel might be involved in that effort, and just any kind of specific timeframes for how things might evolve with that?
Well, not to be too tongue-in-cheek here, flippant, but I'll go back to my answer to Teresa that this is to be effective, it's got to be organic. So it's kind of one of those things that'll happen when it happens, and it'll be as big as it needs to be. The one thing that is going on right now, and this is still sort of preliminary, is as we look at standing up the Integrated Capabilities Office, which is a real office, unlike these other organizations that we're talking about. One of the studies that ICO will likely be looking at is the counter kill chain problem. So if something like a JCLO is going to emerge organically, it would likely be as part of that study. But that's really, as formal as anything gets at this moment.
And just a quick follow-up, what types of personnel would be part of that? Would it be acquisition folks, operators, requirements generators, who would be kind of involved in that?
So I go back to the whole operational imperative kind of model here. The magic of the OIs has been bringing operators and capability developers together. And so the answer is yes, all of the above. Any of these studies we do, regardless of the topic. It could be kill chains, it could be counter kill chains, it could be ACE-like basing, it could be the, CCA air platforms, you name it. Any study team we go do, the same model applies. Operators coming together with capability developers, big, healthy opportunity to inject technology, and all threat informed with intelligence experts. So it really is a one team, one fight kind of model.
Thank you.
Okay, let's go with Todd Newton. Todd?
Yes, Dr. Grayson, can you explain your vision for the CCAs being a more limited ground airfield footprint logistically and operationally when your current CCA offerings require massive ground launchers plus parachute recovery requirements, fuel, and that are demands upon the warfighter and their .mil-PFs to logistically and tactically support?
So I'm not tracking a requirement for parachutes and launchers. There is a need for some runways, but it doesn't necessarily have to be a big NATO standard runway. Obviously, there's going to need to be a need for fuel, and so the notion of some level of tactical logistics is always going to be important. I think my whole point was, if you think about a traditional squadron, I don't pick on any particular aircraft type, but we've always, for instance, had a vertically integrated sort of life cycle system where I've got dedicated set of spare parts, and I've got a dedicated set of maintainers that are rated on that platform, and all of these kind of things that drive a big footprint. And it's those kind of characteristics that CCAs are going to provide the opportunity to be a little more generic and fluid there. And we may develop new operational concepts that day to day, we're not necessarily flying jets every day. Think somewhere in between a tactical aircraft and a cruise missile. And cruise missiles don't go fly every day. Most of the time they live in a weapon storage container. Okay, CCAs are probably going to be closer to that end, which is ultimately going to lead to that lighter footprint.
Okay, well, I've got one quick one for you, if we can, because we're coming up on the end of our time. It's from Bob Ramos. This one's kind of near and dear to both of our hearts. Dr. Grayson at DARPA, one of your concepts was Mosaic Warfare. Today, concepts like CCA are beginning to reflect that disaggregated approach to mission execution. Could you explain how your thinking's evolved in this zone? What did Mosaic get right, and where has your thinking evolved?
So, great question that unfortunately we probably don't have time for. I could expound probably for hours on this one. While disaggregation was a big part of Mosaic, really, I think the thing that we got right, that now the Department of the Air Force is really accelerating and turning into reality, is more about speed and agility. And in fact, the chief mentioned this recently. I apologize to him. I can't remember his exact terminology, but he talked about the importance of agility as being central to the overall Air Force strategy. that was what really was the core of Mosaic, is how do we create the infrastructure, the foundational tools, the architectures, the supporting technologies that allow us to develop new capabilities in a system of systems manner, build system of systems, configure them, like I mentioned with the long range kill chain answer, not needing to have a massive JPO and a massive system engineering design problem to go do these very complex things. And that allows speed. That allows agility. That was the DARPA vision, and that's what the DAF is doing now.
And there's a great Mitchell Institute report on Mosaic Warfare. Go to our website, publications tab, and you can learn more about it.
Mitchell really is at the heart of creating a lot of the concepts there.
Thank you very much. And unfortunately, ladies and gentlemen, we've come to the end of this Aerospace Nation. Tim, really appreciate you taking the time. I think the audience really benefited at hearing your perspective. So to you and all our audience members out there, we wish you all to have a great Air and Space Power kind of day. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. I appreciate the opportunity.